Proofs for God's existence. Can we prove that God exists? That would be great, it would take every doubt away. But I placed a question mark there, for I'm going to discuss, is it possible to prove God's existence? We have many examples of proofs for God's existence. How do you prove things? In geometry or in math, you could prove this by using this technique, for instance. It's error proof. You can prove that this theorem is correct. QED, which had to be proved. It's error proof. So how do we do that usually? You can make a syllogism with 3 entries. The major premise, P implies Q, the minor premise is P, conclusion is Q. If P is the case, then Q is the case, or if P is true, then Q is true. Well, P is true, so Q is true. You can also do this one, very legitimate, but you cannot do this. That is not logically valid. Neither is that one. I will not prove that here, but you can do that with truth tables in logic. Let's not bother with that issue. I discuss proofs for God's existence in these 3 books that I wrote. You can find them on wheredowecomefrom.com with dashes in between. So let's take the first one, which is very often used as a proof for God's existence. If there is design, there is a designer. Well, there is design, so then there must be a designer. That sounds like a very safe proof for God's existence. This is based on the argument from design. If there is design, there is a designer, and it uses the following analogy. A watch is complex and has a designer. Life is complex and therefore by analogy must also have a designer. So if that first premise is true and there is design, then there must be a God. That sounds proof for God's existence. Error proof. However, there is a big however. That first line, based on the analogy, is not really valid. For instance, man and ape are both mammals, but that doesn't mean they both have fur. So the fact that a watch and an organism can are both complex does not imply, by logical necessity, let alone scientific evidence, that they must have an intelligent designer as well. So that is not as error-proof as it sounds. So I think don't bank on that one yet. We might get back to it later. This one might be safer. If there is a designer God, then there is design. Well, there is design, so there must be a designer. Doesn't that sound much safer? Not really, because it's one of those non-accepted syllogisms. It is of this example. To put it differently, if I have the flu, I have a sore throat. Well, I have a sore throat, so I must have the flu. Of course not. There are many other causes. First of all, the problem is that if we start with God, we are taking somehow God's point of view. And God is far beyond us and above us. Having a design doesn't guarantee a designer. There could be other causes of a design. So this is not a definitive proof for God's existence either. So we have nothing left, do we? Yes, remember Thomas Aquinas? He has his famous arguments for God's existence. The first one is based on motion. I will not explain all the steps, they are sometimes very complicated. Thomas Aquinas is not an easy philosopher, but he's a safe philosopher. He has 5 different ways, based on motion, on cause, on being, and there is a 4th one based on contingency. and there is one that is based on design. That is the one I have been using at the beginning, but not really this way. I will explain the difference. So that is the one we talked about before, but I'm going to go back to the contingency one. That's probably the most general one of all 5, and it somehow also covers the other 4 ways of God's existence. It's the argument from contingency. Everything in the world is contingent. That means it can either exist or not exist. I think most people agree on that one. If things can not exist, there must have been a time when they did not exist. If everything in the world cannot exist, there must have been a time when nothing existed. Things exist now, so there must be something on which we all depend, which brought us into existence. And this necessary being we call God. That is the conclusion Thomas Aquinas came to. Father Copleston, a British Jesuit, years ago reformulated this argument on BBC Radio. And he put it this way: it's basically Thomas Aquinas' way. Everything depends on something else for its existence. But there must be a cause of everything in the universe that exists outside of each being. This cause must be a necessary being, one which contains the reasons for its existence inside itself. This necessary being is God. That's how Father Copleston reasoned. So let's go back to this syllogism. If there is a world, then there is a God. I think that comes very close to the third way from contingency. Nothing in this world explains itself as to why it is as it is or why it exists at all. But be careful, Thomas Aquinas does not conclude his reasoning with therefore God exists, quod erat demonstrandum, what had to be proved, but he says, and this all men think of as God. So he is more or less explaining what we mean when we use the word God. They don't prove God's existence, but they clarify what we mean when we speak of God. So it's not a real error proof of God's existence. So if we go back to design, if there is design, then there is a designer. I am not taking that as a logical connection, but as a pointer. Design in the world points to God. So then I can still use this syllogism. It's not a scientific premise, but a philosophical one. So we cannot prove it with analogy that if a watch is complex, then there must be a designer. So if life is complex or the world is complex, there must be a designer. So let's redo our argument. Design is a product of either blind chance or an intelligent designer. However, we can understand chance only against a background of order. For chance means we didn't expect it, and expectation is always based on order. So if it's not chance that explains it, then there must be design. But design comes only from a mind, a designer. Therefore the universe is the product of an intelligent designer. Is this error-proof? Of course not. It's just a pointer. It points to a designer. We either accept that nothing explains itself and leave it at that, which is basically irrational, or we go for rationality, and that's what Thomas's 5 ways do. They go for rationality. Nothing explains itself, and therefore needs a creator God. So Isaac Newton was right that even my thumb alone could convince me of God's existence. How come that we cannot prove there is a God? Because we don't know God from God's perspective, only from ours. So we can't say if there is a God, then there is design. God cannot be measured or quantified the way we measure everything else in science or in regular life. Any demand for scientific evidence through laboratory testing is in effect asking God to come down to our level. God is what Thomas Aquinas called the primary cause, so he could never be discovered among the secondary causes of this universe that science talks about and explores. God is omnipresent. He is all over, so that he seems to be nowhere, but he is only seemingly absent. So we cannot prove that there is a God, but neither can we prove that there is no God. No search can ever reveal the absence of what is being searched for. If someone tells you that a plane crash had no cause, we would say, please keep searching for a cause. No search can ever reveal the absence of a cause. In a similar way, no search can ever reveal that there is no God. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence of God. So I go back to, if there is design, there is a designer God, but not as a scientific statement. It's a philosophical one. We live in a world designed by God. We are surrounded by God. In Him we live and move and have our being, as St. Paul says. They say about fish, the last thing a fish would discover is water, because it's surrounded by water. We are surrounded by God, so the last thing some people discover is God. So let me rephrase the argument. How could there be order in this world if there were no orderly creator? How could there be scientific laws in this world if there were no rational lawgiver? How could there be design in nature if there were no intelligent designer? How could there be moral laws in this world if there were no moral lawgiver? Where else could they come from? How could there be human minds if the universe were mindless? In other words, we are surrounded by God. Only God makes it possible to explain these things. If we want to explain them, which is rationality, then we end up with God. He's at the basis of everything, unless you give up on rationality. So it is not a scientific proof or a mathematical truth, but it's a truth of life. As I told you, I discussed these issues in several books I wrote. This one goes specifically into the avalanche of atheism. You can find it at wheredowecomefrom.com. Another book that goes into this issue. It has all these options, and this chapter in particular covers proofs of God's existence. And then I have a book that is called God and Evolution. And again, it covers, among other things, the issue that we just discussed. Is there more to life than science? What are the roots of rationality and morality? God's presence in His creation.